So, welcome. Good afternoon. Welcome everybody. It's a great honor to introduce this amazing panel. It's a great pleasure to see this room full of people, and I'm glad to see a lot of students. So I have to definitely congratulate Diplomacy, Festival della Diplomazia, for achieving these amazing results. It's even better to see a lot of young faces. The subject that will be discussed this afternoon is the world order predictable? The new world order, is it predictable? I think is an incredible oxymoron. Of course it's not, and of course it is. Of course it is because here there are people who are writing papers and books on that. So if it wasn't predictable, you wouldn't be buying their books, and actually you have to, and read their analysis. Of course it's not, because no one predicted what we have seen in the last couple of years, and please do not believe those who will tell you, I told you so, because it's very difficult to tell you so in all the respective details and forecasts. Even an event that dramatic as the war in Ukraine, I don't think anyone really, until a few months before the war, where of course one should give credit, for example, to the United States, who were really telling us it was going to happen. All the others were a little bit more a more complex situation, a more complex view on whether would that happen or not. Whether it's not predictable, maybe who's going to speak after me will give you much more insight or not, but I think there are a few points which one should take into consideration. There are a few things which are less and less predictable. One is the ecological situation of our planet, which needs to be tackled in the interest of your generation, because that will have incredibly high implication on the new world order. Whether it is the lack of water in the south of the world, where it is raising temperature in the north, both will have geopolitical and a world order effect. The second point is, and this I give you my very humble opinion, retrenching ourselves in islands who do not communicate and maybe occasionally fight is not a great way forward. Many are criticizing globalization. Many are saying globalization failed. Well, globalization, in my, again, very simple opinion, did not fail. What failed were the fiscal policies in many states in redistributing the effect of globalization. We have achieved, or many countries have achieved, incredible growth. Many people were left out of poverty because of globalization, but many people also, especially in the Western world, went into poverty because of globalization. So there has been a very serious incapacity to distribute the gains of globalization in an equal manner, while, for example, the Western world became, on average, richer than it was 20, 25 years ago. And for those who are telling that globalization is a problem, well, imagine what would be the world today with the invasion of Ukraine if China, India, or other countries would not be restrained in their support for Russia, should they be totally disjointed and disconnected from the rest of the world. So one of the things which is certainly be predictable, and with this I stop and I give the floor to the distinguished panel who is going to enlighten you on the world order, is that what the predictability is that the world order will remain complex. The world where you're going to be working is going to be a very complex system. And it is a system where interconnection will continue to be extremely important. And interconnection sometimes needs to be nurtured, mended, in the name of better prosperity for everyone, and finishing with the very famous word of Winston Churchill on that account, possibly promoting democracy, because of all the system that exists, democracy is the worst, bar everyone else. So thank you very much, and I leave the floor to such a panel for a much more enlightened and beautiful discussion. Please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Parenti, and thank you for hosting us today in this place, which is a very important place in Rome, which is the seat of the European Union, and is a place where very often we have discussions and events in which we discuss about developments in Europe and also in the world. Now, today we are going to talk about these questions that Dr. Parenti mentioned. Is the New World Order predictable? And I think that he said that it's very difficult to predict what will be, because of many reasons, of many factors. I will try at the beginning to give a kind of historical perspective. So, how we came to where we are now. We had in the last few years 3 global crises which were succeeding one to the other. There was the financial crisis, which began in 2008 in the United States and gone on for several years in Europe. Then we had the pandemic, and then the Russian aggression to Ukraine with its consequences on energy and food security. All these have speeded up a process already in place since a few decades. And this process was the formation of a multipolar world as a consequence of a number of factors. The first one has been globalization and the economic growth of emerging countries with huge populations, like in particular China and India. There has been then the relative political decline of the United States, in particular after the failure of the war in Iraq. And more recently, there have been, to this effect, some policies of the Trump administration. In this context, we have now a situation of shifting alliances and divergent interests which have emerged, affecting the global political landscape. The world order had a number of adaptations since the Second World War. In the bipolarity of the Cold War, the political, security, and economic order of the West was based on the overwhelming role of the United States through NATO and the Bretton Woods institutions. Then the Suez Crisis in 1956 marked the irreversible reduction of the former colonial powers within the alliance, within the Western alliance. These events boosted decolonization and also the European integration process, promoted by France, Germany, and Italy, with the benevolent attitude of the United States and the refusal of the United Kingdom to participate, together with the strengthening by the United States by the United Kingdom of its ties with Washington. A second change took place at the beginning of the 70s of last century, with the end of the convertibility of the dollar and the beginning of the difficult road toward the establishment of a European common currency, completed only at the end of last century. So it took about 30 years to build up this process. At the same time, we had the oil shocks, which put an end to almost 30 years of economic and social development in the Western world based on low cost of energy. So this also was a major change which took place. Then the end of the war in Vietnam was perceived by the Soviet Union as a weakening of the global American power. And despite the agreements reached at the strategic level between Nixon and Brezhnev with a number of arms control agreements, Moscow developed a political and military offensive in the Third World. At the same time, the convergence between the United States and China to contain the Soviet Union announced the perspective of a tripolar world. The unsustainable overstretching of the Soviet Union, with its peak reached in the war in Afghanistan, brought together with other factors to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. The Western perspective after the end of the Cold War was that the world would be finally shaped by liberal democracy and market economy everywhere. This perception lasted after a couple of decades. In fact, only the positive aspects of globalization were seen at that time. Maximization of productivity and profits, reduction of poverty in emerging countries, growth of people-to-people relations fueled by the development of physical and technological connectivity. Perception changed when it was realized that globalization had also other effects. The risks deriving from excessive dependency from too long supply and value chains, a boost due also to this, to these long value chains around the world, a boost to carbon emissions and therefore of climate change, and also the effects on weak economic sectors in developed countries, with the consequences, together with the technological revolution, on employment and on social and political unrest, as also Dr. Parenti has mentioned. At the same time, the relative weight of the United States was decreasing, while was increasing that of China among emerging countries, because of its extraordinary economic growth, due mainly to an efficient or effective management of globalization. So they took advantage of globalization, and this allowed them to have this extraordinary economic growth for 3 decades practically. A further factor eating the supremacy of the United States and the perception of this supremacy was the rejection of almost 2 centuries or more of Western supremacy on the Islamic world, which produced various reactions, including jihadism, fueled also by the support given to it during the final phase of the Cold War to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan. The reaction to these were the wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan, which, as we have seen, have been a further factor of weakening of the United States. In order to avoid a dangerous global disorder and to rebuild a viable world order in which a common management of common goods, among which the contrast of climate change is paramount, a new set of bilateral and multilateral relations is needed. First, the international legality should be enhanced, starting from the situation in Ukraine. And this requires a cooperation between the main actors of the international community, in particular the United States, China, the European Union, and others. With China, whose assertiveness and quest of a global role pursued by President Xi Jinping has been enhanced by the 20th Congress of the party, of the assessment of rules on trade and investments is necessary. The reduction which is taking place of excessive dependency from China along value chains and on items sensitive under the security point of view is needed, but autarchical closures would be detrimental for world economy and prosperity. On global security, the risk that confrontation in the Indo-Pacific area may bring to dangerous escalation should be avoided. It has to be clear that the use of force for the unification between China and Taiwan should be deterred. At the same time, it should be also clear that one China policy should be not changed. Instead, a policy of engagement for the search of a security architecture in that region should be pursued, including a dialogue on arms control. And this in a framework of dialogue on climate change, on which positive convergence were achieved during the Obama administration at the Paris conference, should be also reopened. The issue of the rising power of China has absorbed most of the concerns and of the diplomatic, intelligence, and military activities of the United States. The events in Europe, in the Middle East, and in Africa, beside those in Asia, have been seen by Washington mainly in this perspective. The Russian aggression to Ukraine has put again Europe at the center of the scene in the American perception. And at the same time, there is again an interest on the Middle East, where the United States, for a reason already seen, had lost a part of its influence. And also in Africa, where in addition to the concern for the spread of jihadism, there is now a concern also for the Russian presence, which benefits of the decline of the French influence in the region. Such presence, the Russian presence, is also a source if not of concern, at least of attention for China. And the four main actors, or would-be actor, the European Union, or the joint action of its major member states, is another element which has to be taken into consideration. The European Union is an economic, trade, and investment giant in the globalized world. It is in the forefront in the fight against climate change and in the decarbonization, but it is not up to now at the same level of the United States and probably of China in the field of new technologies. The same is for military capabilities, and this compelled the European Union member states to continue to rely on the United States and on NATO for their security in front of a revival threat from Russia or from any other power. In the foreseeable future, the European Union may at least aim at having a strategic autonomy with military capabilities for the management of crisis and for stabilization in its neighborhood, in particular in Southeastern Europe, in the Mediterranean, in the Middle East, and in Africa. But in order to achieve this, which needs a common foreign policy, the European Union has to progress in its integration process. This is difficult at the 27 members of the European Union, or more with further enlargement. As you know, Ukraine and the Balkanic countries are going through a process which is going on to join the Union. And in this framework, a kind of differentiated integration, at least in my view, with a core number of countries willing to move forward in the direction of a closer union, should therefore be considered. We are now facing two possible alternatives for an emerging world new order. The first one is a fragmentation of the international system with many fault lines, some more relevant, some less, conflicts, and serious economic and social consequences. We have a fault line between the United States and China, between the United States and European Union on one side and Russia. Another one which is less perceptible at the moment, but which can be there between Russia and China. between European Union and China, especially on trade and economic relation, and also it can come up also differences between the United States and European Union. Within the Union, we have divides between northern member states and southern member states, between western member states and eastern member states. We have divides between Gulf countries and Iran, and in Asia between ASEAN and China, and we have several others of this kind of divides. The second alternative, considering such reality, is the reshaping of a multilateral system for the management of a complex multipolar world, based on possible ways of cooperation on common goods, among which are peace, common prosperity, the fight against global warming, food and energy security, the fight against terrorism and international criminal organizations, the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, arms control, the management of migrations, the respect of international legality broken by the Russian aggression to Ukraine, which should be restored. A very relevant aspect of global perspectives will be the role of Africa, with its huge demographic growth and its rapid but unbalanced economic development during the first 2 decades of the current century, presently hit by climate change, desertification, disputes on water, ethnic and religious conflicts, food insecurity, displacements and movements of peoples, the consequences of COVID and other global crises. As far as Europe is concerned, it is essential as a precondition of the possibility to play a significant role of a geopolitical actor at the global level, is to have a solid understanding between France, Germany, and Italy. The apparent understanding reached just yesterday between President Macron and Prime Minister Meloni, despite previous verbal clashes and different political views, could, together with Spain and others, bring Germany to review positions which have produced recently a divergence between France and Germany. The role played by former Prime Minister Draghi and Macron to convince Germany on energy management shows that this is not impossible. A cooperative management of all this will be very difficult and, according to many people, impossible to achieve, but it is needed and it should be pursued. The incoming international developments in the United States will also be important in determining which direction the world will go. All these factors indicate how much the next world order or disorder is presently rather unpredictable. So I think that this is a preliminary conclusion that we can have about such development. Okay, so now I have ended my introductory presentation, and I will give the floor starting from my right by Dr. Bruno Macias, this is the right pronunciation, Senior Advisor of Flint Global. He is former Secretary of State for EU Affairs of Portugal. Please, you have the floor.
Grazie. Buongiorno, buon pomeriggio. And now I turn to English. So great pleasure to be here and great pleasure to speak to this audience of young people. Let me start with the question, is the world order predictable? Maybe some of you will go into my own line of business, which is the line of business of predicting the future, which is difficult. Most of my time I spend talking to companies about geopolitics, and they have always very specific questions. It's why I like to talk to companies, because as opposed to think tanks or academics or even politicians, they don't as you say in an English expression, they don't beat around the bush, they go straight to the point. I remember back in February I had a couple of phone calls with large multinational companies, and they wanted to know, is Russia going to invade Ukraine and when? And they were asking this at the beginning of February. So this is a requirement that we sometimes are asked to predict the future and to predict where global politics is going. Can you do it? To some extent, I think you can. It's not easy, but I think if you spend enough time looking at how the world works, talking to many people, and that's important. Books are not enough. Talking to many people, traveling, I think it is possible to have a sense of where things are going. Now, you should never make the mistake of wanting to predict very specific events, because very specific events are contingent and they are random. Also, don't make the mistake of trying to predict exactly when things will happen, because that again is very contingent. I think we could see that a war in Ukraine was coming, and we could see it for a long time, and it was inevitable. But to predict that it would happen in February 2022 obviously could not be done. I think, and we were talking about this just before, I think we can see that a conflict in Taiwan is coming. And I would be very confident predicting that there will be a conflict in Taiwan. But predicting when it will happen and what specific form it will happen is probably something you want to try to avoid if you're a diplomat, or if you're a geopolitical consultant, or if you're a writer. In my books, I have been trying not to make specific predictions, but to develop a framework that allows us to see where global politics is going. And today I'd like to talk about two of the main topics in my books, two of my main attempts to make sense of where the world is going. Some things I think are coming to an end, and that's the feeling we all have, that the world order and world politics as we've known it is coming to an end. We don't quite know what will come after, and perhaps it's too early to know what will come after. Gramsci, it's always appropriate to quote Gramsci in Rome. Gramsci says in a famous quote that there's a time of an interlude, an intermezzo, where many strange things happen, and we don't know what comes after yet. It's not born yet, but we know that what existed before is already dead. And I think this is a time of intermezzo, where what comes after is not fully developed yet and can take many forms. Will it be a Chinese world order? Probably not, but China will play a role. But it's not clear what that new world order will be, but the new one is that. So what has come to an end? And I would talk about two main transitions. The first one, which I dedicated my first two books to, I would call it something like the end of the European world. It's always good to talk about the end of Europe in Europe, and I think it's our responsibility to think about that. Everyone around the world is very eager to talk about the end of Europe, I have to tell you. Was in India recently. This is a topic that makes people happy, on the whole. But in Europe, we don't talk so much about it. Always talking about new beginnings, but something like the European world is coming to an end. What do I mean by the European world? Well, I mean the world of the last 2, 3, potentially 400 years. In Portugal, people would like to say that the European world started at the end of the 15th century. Maybe in Italy, people would like to say that the European world started at the beginning of the 15th century in Florence with the Renaissance, or with the modern age, or with the technological revolutions. Certainly a world where Europe was the global leader, where technological cultural developments happen in Europe and then radiated to the rest of the world, and where Europe very quickly became the master of the whole world. Which countries escaped European colonialism? Well, very few, if any, in fact. That's an interesting question to ask. You could say that Turkey was never really colonized, but then perhaps Turkey was part of Europe. Or if not really colonized, Turkey was certainly under, in the 19th century, under significant European influence and control. You could say that China was not fully colonized, but it was certainly under European control, and many parts of China were in fact colonized. You could certainly say that Russia was not colonized, and that's actually the importance, the historical importance of Russia. Either you think that Russia is part of Europe, or you think that Russia is not part of Europe. If Russia is not part of Europe, it's the only country in the world that was never really subject to European colonialism. But it's a remarkable fact, very unique in history, that the whole globe came under control of a small region that used to be peripheral. A tiny peninsula in Eurasia came to control the whole world. Well, that world is over. Europe no longer has control over the whole world. And what is interesting is that perhaps Europeans used to think that even after Europe lost control, political control over the world, that European civilization would spread all over the world. And in fact, the case of the United States is a little bit like that. You could, the United States became the most powerful country in the world, but you could argue that it belonged to the European world, to the European cultural, civilizational world. It was still representing the same principles, the same values. Now, I think that at the current moment, it's very clear that the United States is breaking apart from this European world. In many respects, I think becoming unintelligible to Europeans. I went to study in the United States a little over 20 years ago, and I went there with the sense that this was really part of the European world, and in some respects it was, but in other respects it no longer was, and I think today even less. And I think a young European like yourselves going to the United States today will find it a very different world. Some things impossible to understand, in fact. So I think the United States can no longer be regarded as part of the European world, but more dramatically, Russia no longer sees itself as part of the European world. Turkey no longer sees itself as part of the European world. And Europeans used to have the expectation, very utopian and unrealistic, that even countries like China and India would embrace European principles somehow. This used to be firmly believed 20 years ago. I think we know better now, and we know that China has picked its own path. India very clearly is picking its own path, which is not of a Western-style liberal democracy. It is very different, trying to recover the principles of Hindu civilization. This is the task that everyone is taking up in India today. And the country, although a democracy, is a very different kind of democracy from democracies in Europe. So this is a fragmented world. It's not a world ruled by homogeneous principles. It's a world of different civilizations that may or may not clash, but a world of very different civilizations. And obviously a very dangerous world, because it's a world that is no longer subject to a clear hierarchy. It's no longer an organized world. It's a world that no longer has a center. And it's a world where there are many different cultural and civilizational differences. But at the same time, it's a world where everyone exists at the same level of development. What is remarkable about China is that we can no longer say that it is an underdeveloped country, but at the same time, it's a country that is not converging to Western or European principles. So with all of these civilizations existing at the same level, but being fundamentally different between themselves, it is a fragmented world, and it is a world with no clear hierarchy. If you ask what is the capital of the world today, it used to be very simple to say it was Rome, used to be very simple to say it was Paris, and then it was London, and then it was New York. And what is the capital of the world today? Any suggestions?
Riyadh.
No.
Riyadh, certainly a regional capital. When I get asked this question, I actually answer, because it would be very unrealistic to say Shanghai or to say Beijing. That's kind of the model where there's a new city that comes after the previous one and that takes over. And that works with Paris, Berlin, London, New York. But actually, when people ask me this question these days, I respond Twitter. Twitter is the capital of the world. So where the real action happens. And I think if you're living in Manhattan, without access to the internet, you're in a much worse shape than if you're living in a small village in the middle of nowhere with access to the internet. I don't even know what would be the point of living in Manhattan without access to the internet. You would go to some cafe, there would be some people working on their laptops. Nothing is happening in those cafes. This is not like the Rome or the Paris of the 19th century where you go to a cafe and someone gets up and reads a political manifesto. Nothing happens in the city. Everything happens on the internet. And that takes me to my second subject, technology. That's the second big change, I think. So the end of the European world on the one hand, and then something like the end of the natural world. I think we're living in the middle of that transition from a natural to an artificial world. This is relevant for the climate change, the idea of the Anthropocene, which you must have heard about, that we now live in a world that is so controlled by human beings that the decisive question is what human beings will do, and they are capable of either destroying or saving their own natural environment. But also, I think, other transformations. Our world is now profoundly technological from the ground up. It's very difficult now to find the natural world. This is obvious in a very immediate sense. If you land in the city airport in London and take the train from City Airport, which is a little south of the Isle of Dogs, the new financial center, and you take the train, it's maybe 20 kilometers from City Airport to the center of London, you probably are not going to see any natural entity apart from human beings. You're not going to see a tree, you're not going to see a plant, you're not going to see an animal. You drive for 20 kilometers and it's everything is concrete, it's a fully artificial world. It's quite an eerie experience if you think about it. So that's one sense in which we live in an artificial world, but the pandemic showed other senses. Suddenly in the pandemic, a lot of things became possible. It became possible to work remotely. It became possible to migrate to the internet. It became possible to have your social, intellectual, amusement experiences, work experiences, all on the internet. They turned out to be quite poor, and they didn't compare to experiences in real life. But interestingly, the conclusion was, well, maybe we should make digital experiences better. And even during the pandemic, you started to hear a lot about the metaverse, il metaverso. Must be many books about this in all our cities now, in bookshops. And this is the idea that we're going to build a completely digital world, but this is going to be a great digital world, not like Zoom. We're going to be wearing 3D glasses and sit around a table. You will feel very real. We can have our business meetings there. You will shop not on an Amazon web page, but you will shop on a virtual mall, shopping mall, where you walk using your 3D glasses, go into stores. These virtual stores in the metaverse are going to be sold for billions of dollars, because what is the point of having a store in the center of Rome if you can have a store in the metaverse and 8 billion people can go there every day? So this is, I think, the world we're heading towards. And if you buy an Oculus Quest, Oculus is now being bought by not Facebook but Meta. They changed their name, predicting this new world of the metaverse. If you buy the Oculus Quest, it's only 300 euros. And I actually recommend it because it's much better than you expect. The glasses are pretty heavy and they warm up, so that has to be solved. But the experience is quite dramatic. You really feel completely immersed. You're playing ping pong and it doesn't feel different from the real thing. So I think the technology in 10 years will be very good. And we'll see more and more of this. You buy a car in the metaverse and you test it with your 3D glasses, and then you buy it in the metaverse and it is delivered to your home, the physical car. But by the way, when you buy a physical car, you get as a gift a virtual car that you can ride in the metaverse, a copy of the physical one. This is the world I see happening. And where you can have many different personalities. I think all of you already on social networks have your own personality, which is different from your real personality. The new generation is very different on this. And in the metaverse, this will be accentuated. But the pandemic also showed another path of development towards new biotechnologies. The mRNA vaccines are completely different from the previous vaccines. They really are a form of genetic engineering. I didn't like to say this in my talks until recently, because the anti-vaccine people would use this as an argument against the vaccines. I think it's an argument in favor of the vaccines, that they are so sophisticated, new technologies, that they don't work the way the old vaccines used to work. They are really ways of using your genome in order to produce results, and we're going to see more and more of this. I think we're going to see mRNA vaccines for cancer, for malaria very soon, within the next year or two, and then new biotechnologies that will increasingly divorce human beings from the natural world. The end of the natural world, I'll finish with this, is also very dangerous. The end of the European world is dangerous, inevitable but dangerous. The end of the natural world is also dangerous. Not only because of climate change, but because, think about this, if the world of tomorrow is going to be completely artificial, lots of us would be interested in asking, well, isn't this a bad thing? We'll lose contact with nature. Isn't this a bad thing because of climate? Isn't this a bad thing because in the end we're all going to be living in the metaverse rather than the real world? These are all real problems. But we tend to forget another significant problem, which is who is going to build this artificial world? Because whoever builds the artificial world is going to control it. The geopolitical battles of the future are not about who controls this particular territory, are not about who controls this island or this port or this peninsula. The geopolitical battles of the future are about who builds the world, not who controls the physical world as it already exists, but who builds the virtual world of the future. Is it going to be China? Is it going to be the United States? Is it going to be Europe? But whoever builds the world is necessarily knows how this world works, has access to the control switches of the virtual world, can manipulate it, can turn it off, can turn it on. It is a form of power that we have never known in human history. The ability to build a world within which all of us are going to be living. And I advise you to see the news from last week about the United States, China, and chips, and how the United States decided to ban China from importing, buying chip-building equipment and chips from the United States, to see how this war to control the technological world of the future is already in full swing, in full speed, and is going to be with us for the next few years and decades. Grazie.
Thank you. In fact, you made a prediction of what could be the world. And of course, there is a matter of which will be the powers who are going to build to control that. It will be one power, more power. It will be a cooperative action by several powers. So this is an issue which is open. I have only one point about colonialism that you mentioned. Now, Russia has been a colonizing power. Differently than Portugal or Spain or the Netherlands or Britain. It didn't go overseas, but it colonized most of Asia. And this is a factor which is now producing some consequences, and also on the relations between Russia and China. It is something which is still present. Without mentioning Japan, which was a country which escaped the European colonization but became himself a colonial power in Asia.
Yes, the case of Japan is the defeat in World War II, and then the American power after 1945. But I completely agree with you on Russia. This is something I also challenge you to think about, that what is happening in Ukraine is a colonial war, a traditional colonial war, not so different from France's war in Algeria, and that we should learn how to think about Russia as a colonial power. Certainly that's how Ukrainians think about Russia. An empire does not have to be an overseas empire. It can be contiguous in territory.
Thank you. Okay, now I would like to ask Dr. Stefano Pelagi to take the floor. He's Director of International Relations of Geopolitica Info and a journalist in this magazine. Please.
Thank you very much. Let me tell you, it's going to be a very difficult task to speak after such a big global perspective on the new world order made by Professor Magash. And my role here is, I've been mostly working on China, Greater China, and Taiwan. So we don't really get a sense of things where are going. When people mostly focus on what is called area studies, now on a small piece of territory, and The biggest example is probably what happened in Russia. I got a lot of colleagues working on Russia, on post-Soviet Union territories, and none of them got a clue of what was going to happen. This happened because we do sometimes get some kind of emotional involvement in the objective that we study, in all those nuances that we try to stress and we try to observe every day. So my perspective here is basically to tell you, I don't know if the world order is going to change. Probably we cannot predict. I do not think that this change will come over a conflict for Taiwan. I do not think that this will happen in the near future. It is very true that the future world order won't be a future of homogeneous principle. Until now, the challenge to the world order, to the unipolar world order, has not been successful in stressing a new direction. I don't think that Hindu nationalism, a Confucian approach, could be attracting, could generate a push for somebody living outside India or China. Yeah, we all know the global project launched by China, but I do really think that they cannot compete with the attraction that what Professor Magaesh called the European world has exerted over the decades, over the century, and what the American culture has more or less done for at least 100 years. This doesn't mean that we will still be living in this unipolar world. So it will be a totally different world. It will be a totally different world, which, of course, it won't be will be a very fragmented world, and this will be a very dangerous world and a very different world from what we live now. Speaking about technology, I've been following TV and cinema in China very closely. I think that TV series, film are the new book, are the most important way in which culture has been transmitted. Well, Chinese film were really interesting until 15 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago. But with the last turn of Chinese politics, this primacy of the politics inside the People's Republic of China, I do think, and most of the scholars who study these say that the content of this film made it so boring. There's no contrast. You know, in a film you need the bad guy and you need the good guy. Well, sometimes you see those Chinese films and there's no bad guy. So it's kind of disorientating. And I think this will be very, very important in what Magaesh just said about this idea of the technology, because it's not only building these glasses which allow us to enter this new world, but is more than everything building the architecture of this world. So even if until now the app and the social sphere in the People's Republic of China has shown an incredible vitality, I do not think that such a projection, such a primacy on politics can produce a storytelling, such an ambitious storytelling which can fit a project like the metaverse. Going back to Taiwan, I do not think that a conflict can start over Taiwan. Just make you a very brief resume of what Taiwan is. Taiwan is an island, a little bit bigger than Sicily, very close to the Chinese coast, and it is very hard to think of a real invasion, what we might call boots on the ground on Taiwan. Okay, so that kind of action would put a lot into stake. It would be a big bet for the Chinese government. All the policy paper which came out in the last 2-3 years, and I'm not talking the US policy paper, which of course stress the importance of defending Taiwan, but even in Japanese, even the European Union policy paper stress the need to maintain the status quo, which means maintaining the situation as it is, with a very peculiar international projection of Taiwan, but no any kind of military force action, Chinese force action in the island. So I do not think that Beijing could risk such a big attempt over the future of Taiwan in we call it in 5 years or in 10 years. Again, you shouldn't really think, you should really hear somebody who has been studying this, probably somebody who has a global perspective, can do way better prevision about this. But there are other options on the table, for example, a possible naval blockade and so on. But we do even have to think that Taiwan is not Ukraine. Taiwan is the place where 60, 65, 70% of the high-level semiconductor are produced. Today, semiconductor, the chip, are not only the tool of our iPhone, of our computer, of our car, but are even an very important, crucial asset, strategic asset. We all seeing what is happening in Ukraine with the drones, and the need of those kind of tool, those kind of chip in order to defend, to protect a country. So the Taiwan case is very peculiar. I do see more possible some kind of change in the world order coming somewhere else in the South China Sea. I do see a change in the world order coming in the border between India and China. We do even have to think that there is a big rivalry between Delhi and Beijing. I do not think that the capabilities of the People Liberation Army are now ready. They will be probably ready in a few years, but I do not think that even the Chinese public opinion is ready for a war which can bring, for the first time in decades, blood on the Chinese people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As you see, there can be two different predictions about the possibility of a conflict, of a real conflict on Taiwan, or the fact that the situation can be freed for consider the future. President Xi Jinping has said that took the commitment to have the unification before 2046. Now, between now and 2046, many things can happen. You will see, we don't know, but in any case, it will be interesting to watch what will happen. So now I would like to ask to Professor Philippe Schmittel, who is Professor Emeritus at the European University Institute, Professor of Political Science. Please, Professor.
Well, buonasera a tutti. Devo parlare inglese, no?
Yeah.
Okay, English. Okay, easier for me. The topic I have been given is the impact of the Ukrainian war on the future of Europe. I haven't the faintest idea why I was asked to talk about this. I am not a military expert, and I have never claimed to be a futurologist capable of. Nevertheless, I'm going to try to make some sense of it. I think there's only one thing we can agree upon. The Ukrainian war is going to have an impact. It's going to have an impact which is going to be, I think, enduring, and therefore the topic is worth speculating about. I do not have the usual methodology of futurologists in mind, which essentially is the projection forward of trends and trying to understand how these trends will affect each other. That's, if it's a science, that's what its basis usually is. I proposed to think dialectically. That is to say, to think about the two worst possible or best possible outcomes of the Ukrainian war, and leave it more or less to you to figure out which one of these is going to prevail, or what kind of combination of the two. So, let's start with the optimistic scenario. The human and material costs of the Ukrainian war will be sufficient to convince all conceivable protagonists that unilateral armed attempts at expanding territory and or sovereignty in Europe are counterproductive. They cost much more than they conceivably produce as benefits for the aggressor, and that will continue to be so in the future. Footnote, that applies to China and Taiwan. So if this is the scenario, the Chinese are very, very unlikely to try anything in Taiwan. And as was observed by the previous speaker, it's a much more difficult problem to invade Taiwan than to cross a wheat field from Russia to the Ukraine. So I think we can, that scenario, provided this scenario holds, the optimistic one, I think we can forget about any future attempt by China to physically subordinate or invade Taiwan. Oh, never mind, okay. The region, i.e. Europe, will enter into the realm of what Immanuel Kant called permanent peace, imagined by Kant as a voluntary exchange of commerce, investment, travel, social exchange, marriage, living in different, regulated by mutual recognition and institutionalized negotiation in the event of conflicts of interest, and that will become the norm. Second point, the principal beneficiary of this will be the European Union, whose tasks will be extended to cover such core areas of stateness as defense against external threats, policing and adjudication of internal disputes, conditions of citizenship and control of borders, not to mention related areas of fiscal harmonization, public health, and social welfare. In other words, those of Max Weber, the EU will acquire a monopoly of the exercise of legitimate violence within a given and probably further enlarged territory. Third point, in order to acquire the requisite legitimacy to accomplish this expansion of its tasks, the European Union will have to change its institutions substantially and procedurally in order to make them credibly democratic, which they are not at present. i.e., it will have to create channels for participation that are meaningful to its citizens and capable of holding its rulers accountable. Accomplishing this peacefully and including such a number and variety of previously independent political units will be an unprecedented task, but it will be facilitated by a favorable outcome of the Ukrainian war. Essential to this task will be the creation of a European party system that transcends and not just transposes the pre-existing national and subnational party systems. I'm sure, as you all know, there is something that calls itself in Brussels and sometimes in Strasbourg, the secretariats for European parties, but nobody even knows their names, much less believes that they have any real significance. The embryo is there, and that's obviously the point at which one has to build, and this will involve shifting the nomination of candidates to the party secretariats in the European Parliament, as well as the direct and exclusive allocation of public funds directly to them. As you all probably know, the European Union finances elections to the European Parliament, but it does through national parties. Footnote. One of the problems with this scenario, I've been writing about this, so I apologize for an extraneous remark, is the growing weakness and insignificance of national political parties. So the real democracy deficit in Europe is not the European one, it's the national one, and especially great in national party systems. And the worse that deficit gets, the more national parties will try to hang on to the last conceivable euro they can get out of the European Union, and even some status or prestige because they nominate candidates. So it's not going to be easy to overcome, so to speak, this resistance from national parties. So the more decadent they are, the more unlikely they are to give up these particular privileges that have been granted to them. Fifth, Euro democratization will be facilitated, however, by a substantial decline in the financial and human resources previously dedicated to external defense. So one of the nice features of so-called Kantian eternal or perpetual, I guess he called it, peace, will be a decline, presumably, in military expenditures, and that presumably can be used by the European Union to promote what we call upward convergence. In other words, to subsidize or to improve the standard of living and social security, etc., of the lesser endowed countries, so that there is a convergence of lifestyle as well as life circumstances across the member states of the European Union, which presumably would be more than the present 26, I think it is. That's another issue. Finally, the success of such a project in Europe would encourage other world regions to imitate it and promote the sort of piece by pieces. It's one of my favorite phrases. I think it's Joe Nye, he's a professor at Harvard, and a friend of mine. I think he invented the idea that the formula for world peace is not a world government, etc. It's piece by pieces. So you create regionally based peaceful systems, and then they negotiate with each other, and you get piece by pieces, so to speak, as a potential future. Okay, now, on the downside, the pessimistic scenario. The human and material cost of the Ukrainian war proved to be limited, and Russia acquires several additional provinces of the former eastern Ukraine, which provide it with significant additional agricultural and other export resources, in addition to its already predominant position as the energy supplier to Europe. Second point, the principal reason for this success is the increase in internal dissent within the European Union in response to its policies of economic sanction, weapons distribution, and energy independence from Russia. This not only eliminates the likelihood of any further expansion of its competences, EU ones, but reduces it to its initial focus upon the reduction of barriers to commercial exchange between member states and their subsequent regulation. The so-called acquis communautaire becomes increasingly differentiated as they opt in and opt out according to diverse perceptions of national interest. So the EU essentially becomes a limited free trade area. That's the third point. Now reduced to a free trade, exercises no pressures to develop into a democratic polity with its own financial resources and direct capacity to implement binding decisions on either member states or their respective populations, not to mention as an actor in the international system. National party systems, already in decline, will fragment even further, stimulated by populist reactions from both the right and left to the collapse of a unified European response to the war, and by the efforts of a triumphant Russia to intervene in their competition. 5. Member states of the EU will be compelled to increase expenditures on defending themselves from not merely Russia, but from neighboring states, especially from a renewed and more resourceful Russia. They will be tempted to enter into competing alliances with each other and with outside powers. Read China. Finally, Europe returns to its previous intrinsically unstable balance of power between national states of unequal capacity and probably with different political regimes, which in turn demonstrate to the rest of the world the inherent impossibility of peaceful processes of regional integration as a formula for global governance. So that's the worst scenario. The current trends on the battlefield are encouraging for those who would prefer scenario 1. I suppose that's everybody in this room. But obviously, the most important event that's about to happen is the one that's always been in favor of Russia, the winter. The longer and nastier it is, the better it will be for the Russians, as was proven to Napoleon and others. And therefore, one can expect that with this protracted high energy costs, etc., by the war, that the longer the winter and the more severe it is, the more likely we will begin to get these internal divisions within the EU and countries making, quote, special deals for energy in particular with the Russians, and therefore the more likely the second scenario becomes. I'll leave it to you to decide what the future holds for Europe.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor. I think that you pointed very clearly how important it is to go forward in the European integration process.
Yes.
Not only for Europe, but also for the rest of the world, because this is the most important example on how you can overcome conflicts which went on for centuries into a system of mutual cooperation for the management of common goods.
But it needs more than cooperation.
It
It
means
means creating a really
it means
regional
integration.
government which
Yes,
is
yes,
capable of
yes,
having
yes.
its own resources and intervening.
We had decades of cooperation and of integration on particular fields. These pieces were put together, and now we have to make the further steps where all this is framed in a kind of federal system, because it's what you...
I don't like the word federal.
correct.
That's
Okay,
poisonous.
but you don't like, but it's what it is.
Please
I mean,
don't describe me as a federalist.
I don't describe you as a federalist, but I mean, if you want to have a governance which can...
Okay, we need a new word. Okay.
What would be the new word?
Well, the one I use in what I'm
Yeah.
writing is
Yeah.
post-liberal.
Okay, but post-liberal is not
It's
about...
a democracy, yes, okay. I haven't found a word
But
yet.
it's not about the kind of... governance.
Confederal is, some
No,
people use.
confederal, no, it's not
Well, no,
the word.
the word I use
Yeah.
is consociational. Now, that's too academic, I'm sorry.
not
but
enough,
that-
it's not enough.
yeah.
Yes.
But it is a concept that's in the academic literature, usually applied to places like Switzerland and formerly the
Well, there is a
Netherlands and
federation,
Austria.
I mean, this place
So
is called
consociational, I was using Latin, consortio,
Consortium, yeah, okay.
okay?
But
Voilà.
we can be more ambitious than that.
We'll see. Okay.
So now I give the floor to Maurizio Caprara, who is a journalist, a political analyst, a good friend of mine, and he's writing on several Italian newspapers, in particular Corriere della Sera. And you were in Corriere della Sera,
yes.
okay. So now I give to him the floor.
Thank you very much. Talking about the winter, I hope that we won't have the global warming, but an European warming, so it will be better for us. I think that any one of us can make mistakes, but I think that it's possible that in our position we can recognize more, I don't know if it works, yes, more than you, that in this part of the table, we were as you are, and you. It's more difficult maybe for you to imagine that you will become as we are. I was thinking, I had a speech, then I remembered when Mr. Melani introduced this meeting, that I don't see Mr. Melani very frequently, but three times a year. But I remember, and I can't forget when I met him, and I was 28. As a journalist, I had a news in a funny way. A politician was in a lunch talking about what he have done in the days before, and he told he was in a governmental exercise to test the capability to reactions of the NATO government to a Soviet attack, a Soviet nuclear attack. In that case, that politician talk openly about this, but other journalists were interested in news about the political chronicle of that days and didn't recognize that there was a news inside. That was a secret. So I went to my newspaper and said, I heard something that is very, very curious. There has been an exercise in which the NATO government simulated a war with the USSR, and when the West German was called to launch an atomic bomb on the eastern side of Europe, they refused. Also in the exercise, the government said, no, we cannot also pretend to do such like act of war. My problem was to find confirmations to this, to the proofs that it was true what I heard. And so I went to the Foreign Affairs Ministry, where Ambassador Melani, now ambassador, was an official, an important official, working with the minister, and he told me a part of the reality. I don't know if it was, but what I could understand it was
I
that
didn't know the rest. I didn't know the rest.
you didn't know the, I don't know, but I mean, we were in different roles. I was a journalist, interested in knowing the much possible of news about these informations about this case. And he was a diplomat, so he had to defend the institution and try to avoid that it was possible a terrible leak. Anyone made his rule. But I'm telling this to notice with you what has changed since that time. USSR, which was the second superpower in the world, doesn't exist. The Germany, two Germanys, is now one Germany. All the political parties that were in the majority of the government and also in the opposition doesn't exist anymore in Italy. The debate about nuclear weapons and the disarmament is disappeared for years and years in the national scenes and maybe also in the international scene. And now we have a threat coming from Moscow, but not from the USSR, and we have an attention again about the danger of the nuclear weapons. So I just say this to give you the perception, to suggest you to have the perception that a lot of things you are seeing now around you and in the world will change, will not be the same. I don't know which one, but you have to, like in the traffic in Rome, you have to find a way. And it's not easy. Yes, now there is Google Map, but pretend you have not the cell phone. You have to find your right way with experience, asking, and deciding where is for you more convenient to go for understanding for understanding the future. And the first effort you have to do is to be free. Free from prejudice and free from the need to reassure yourself, believing that what will happen is what will be right. What will happen is different. It's another thing. It's not a moral decision, but it's the combination of several factors. And I think that the right approach is the one that Professor Mackay suggested, so looking not just politics, but economy, science, society, looking a lot of things. And of course, we are in the middle of a technological revolution. Any revolution is not a revolution if it doesn't make, if it doesn't produce some bloods and some deaths. And in this case, we will have the death of some, we already have the death of some jobs, of some way of living, communicating. And so be prepared to see a lot of changes. In these, you have to avoid, I suggest you to avoid to believe to the first path that is proposed to you. Umberto Eco, who was a writer but also an analyst, wise analyst of culture and communications, remember that at the beginning of the 20th century, the general opinion was that the airship was the way of flying in the future. And the airship was what is going to change all the aviation history. It didn't happen. So sometimes you can see something that looks the future and it is not. And so you have to combine different elements and try to bomb your ideas, trying to see if they can resist to all the counterattacks of other possibilities that you have to consider. Sometimes the reality, I'm not saying it's not easy. I don't believe that the story repeats itself. But we have to do in some ways as a generations an exchange. You are in a platform, not in informatic platform, like a physical platform, in which you can jump in the future better than us. Because your idea, for example, is more easy for you to imagine a future without oil and gas, because already you have seen something like this. But at the same time, you have the platform, but you need the software, and the software is improve the knowledge of the past and what can happened in the past and can give some continuous possibility of development of facts and matters. So sometimes the future can be seen, but is not seen. I think phenomena of the 2006, 2007, 2008, there was a huge increase in the prices of the cereals. And it was a problem for the famine, for poor people, for markets. And later on, it was more clear that the cause, one of the main causes of this jump in the prices was the higher cost of the energy and the investments in agriculture to produce biofuels. And so But it was understood later, not before, not during, and it was possible to do it also before. Another aspect of the possibility to know the present and the future, not just looking to some organization like the Spectre or superpowers hidden in the dark, but looking to the reality. This is a study of the Council on Foreign Relations. The title is Improving Pandemic Preparedness, Lesson from COVID-19. And in this study of an independent task force, there is a list of studies that were saying that there was a possibility of a pandemic aggression to the world. And there is written, for nearly 3 decades, countless epidemiologists, public health specialists, intelligence community professionals, national security officials, and think tank experts have underscored the inevitability of a global pandemic of emergent infectious disease. And it was not just an opinion made on data, recent data, but also there was written, pandemics are not random events. Outbreaks of well-known infections and new diseases occur regularly. Those outbreaks can spread easily on this interconnected planet and impose significant and human and economic costs, making preparedness imperative. So sometimes the mysterious reality is closer than we think, and we have to imagine, to be freely, to have minds open and free to understand what we would like to avoid to see. In these cases, I would say that we can notice that the better vaccines against the COVID-19 has been produced by democracies, because the competition inside democracies produces the best results. But at the same time, we can't not see that there is a new attractive capability of not liberal regimes that can decide fastly than democracy can do, in a time in which the communications and also the politics becomes faster and change very rapidly. For example, in this case, I suggest you to read the interview that Mr. Putin gave 1 or 2 years ago to the Financial Times, saying that democracy is in crisis and now we have to do something of different. We should do also something of different. And in particular in Asia, this message can be very, very important. And I would say these are not the solution of the question of the title of the debate, but are just some suggestions that I think can be useful.
Thank you. We have some time for questions, and for us to answer to your question or to your comments. So I don't know if there is any of you would like to put. Please, I have now two persons for the moment. Please, you. Yes. Sì, vai. Vai, tu. Sì, arriva.
To finish before 5.
Before 5, yes, before 5. Sorry, before 5, not before 6.
He was looking too much to the future.
Yes, I was looking too much to the future, you're right. No, I would like, before you start, I would like to say one thing about the exercises that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. Yes. Now, NATO always do exercises. I mean, its job is to prepare what can happen. And perhaps the peculiarity of the one on which you are asking to me, it is that was an exercise in which the highest levels of government were involved. Okay. But then there was also a particular feature that these exercises were in some way communicated to the Russia, to the Soviet Union. And there was a line of communication saying, look, we are doing this, so be aware that this can happen, and also the other were doing the same. So there was a communication. Now, unfortunately, I'm afraid that this do not exist anymore. And this is why the situation today is much more dangerous than it was at the time of the Cold War. So please.
Good afternoon. I'm Davide Cerella, a second-year student of Global Governance, University of Rome Tor Vergata. And my question is, so we said that we can predict the future wars and future conflicts, and especially the next conflict will probably be the one with, between Taiwan and China. So what could Europe do? Is there something that Europe can do to, I'm not saying to prevent the escalation, but at least to limit the damages that this conflict could cause to the entire global economy, especially I'm thinking to the microchip productions. Thank you.
We take a couple of questions and then we're going to the panel to answer. Please. One there, behind the column, yes.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Gokul. I'm a global governance second-year student as well from India. My question is the same. Last week we had the Austrian ambassador, and I asked him the very same question, and I would ask the same question to get a different perspective. My question is specifically to Professor Bruno, because he mentioned about the end of the European world. So my question is regarding the future of Europe and the relevance of European Union, considering the fact that if we see that Italy has had 7 governments in 11 years, Britain, though not part of European Union, but still geographically closer to Europe, has had its 3rd Prime Minister this year. And in the West, we have the United States of America. And with the rise of China and my own country, India, and then we have the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, and as well as Afghanistan, which I think that everyone has forgot about the Afghanistan conflict. Where do you see the future of Europe, the relevance of European Union? And can we finally conclude that the world is not Eurocentric anymore? Thank you.
One further question was behind. Yes, please.
Did he say specific?
So, good afternoon. My name is Raul Elia, and I'm also a second-year student at Global Governance. My question is related to what Professor Kais said. Sorry for mispronouncing your surname. You said that it's particularly difficult to prevent the future or to have a provision regarding the future. But regarding, for example, the Russian escalation in Ukraine, we know that Russia had a financial plan regarding buying euros, and also there were troops that were starting to move or to be stable at the border with Belarus and with Belarus at first, and also a month before or some weeks before the attack. There was already in various networks the news that probably Russia would have attacked Ukraine once the Winter Olympics would have ended. So is it really impossible, or can there be a chance to not prevent totally those events, but to be ready to be ready to react, let's say, to that? Thank you.
Okay, so we have 3 questions. The first one is about what can Europe do in order to diffuse the conflict, possible conflict between China and Taiwan. Who would like to answer to this?
I can.
Okay.
I can answer. Well, the conflict, I doubt it will be between Taiwan and China. It will be like a conflict between the 2 biggest power in the world. It would be a conflict between People's Republic of China and somehow the United States of America, and I think that there is no way in which the European Union can prevent, can or could do something about it. There's very few things that unfortunately, very few space of action for the European Union in such a conflict, apart from some kind of measure that will have no effect. Regarding the semiconductor and how can we prevent the defense of this very important tool? We have to think that semiconductor is not like Taiwan doesn't have a mine of semiconductor. No, it's a global process. So basically, most of the semiconductor are designed in London by an Israeli-based company with Japanese or Israeli software. The design is shipped to Taiwan. Only the design, it takes a big effort. You have to imagine that the dimension of those chips is really small. They've been sent to Taiwan, where all the chips are produced with Japanese and American machinery. And then after they're produced with mostly Japanese material, silicium, and then they're sent to Southeast Asia to be tested, and then to China, where they build the product. So as you can understand, it's a global process which involves everything that we spoke about today. So it's there's no way to protect, and there's no way we can do something. It's something that is so interconnected, this is basically impossible to preserve if the world order is somehow damaged.
Thank you. If I can add one point on this, the fact that the conflict, possible conflict, will be between China and the United States, in some ways is reassuring, because it means that, in my view, none of them would like to go to a global war with all the consequences that this will bring. And without going even to a global war, both they have an interest to not destroy completely the world economy as it has built in the last decades. Of course, there will be changes, even important changes. The value chains will change, perhaps. There will be a reduction or a shortening of the value chains. But on many aspects, for the reasons that you just mentioned, I mean, there will be a common interest not to destroy all this. So what Europe can do? I think that what Europe can do is to lead in some way the way of promoting a cooperation on certain aspects, vital aspects, which will, as I was trying to say in my introduction, I mean, to reshape the kind of relations which exist with China, to control the security aspects which are involved, but at the same time keep a kind of cooperation. At the end of 2020, there was a trade and investment agreement which was concluded between the European Union and China. The Americans were not very happy, but this agreement was introducing some new elements, as the concept of reciprocity, as other concepts which were not present in other agreements. And this could be a way on which also the United States could benefit. Then this agreement was shelved because there were the problems concerning Xinjiang and the Uyghurs. There were positions which were taken, especially in the European Parliament. There were counter, let's say, reactions by China and so on, and the matter was shelved. Then the general climate toward China has changed compared to what it was before. But I think that if we think to the possibility to go towards the best scenario that the professor was thinking to, on this Europe perhaps can have a role, without the coupling from the United States, but working always in closer connection with the United States, but with perhaps a capability of moving which Europe can have better than the United States under certain points of view.
If I may add, we shouldn't forget that we have crucial regional actors such as Japan, Australia,
yes.
that they seems ready to be part of an alliance. I don't see something else on the other side, because the Russia, China seems a little bit tricky.
And India, China also, and so on. Okay, Yes.
I have to confess, I'm a little bit surprised at this, how much attention is being paid to the China-Taiwan issue. I think it's extremely unlikely. But I have to share, I've been teaching in China. Students like you at Fudan University in Shanghai. And I think that we have to be careful between the image that is projected by Xi and the top levels of the party and what's actually going on in China. And so you have to pay much more attention to the intergenerational changes that are occurring inside Chinese society. And if you, as I say, I had this experience of teaching there now for, 4 years. They don't let me go anymore. I'm not acceptable anymore. The regime is getting more and more autocratic, that's for sure. And one of the victims is myself, but that's all right, because I enjoy teaching. I teach democratic politics in China at Fudan University, and I have students, as I say, like yourselves, and I know what sort of good sense. Chinese young people are very good at compartmentalizing their lives. They know what they can say in public and in print, and they also know what they're really thinking themselves. So I think we tend to form an image of China which is excessively focused on the top levels of the party. But one other comment. I gave a talk at the party school in Beijing. It's a wonderful place, incidentally, beautiful.
I know it, yes. I've been there, yes.
And the main topic of the talk, or the main thing I discovered at this, was the obsession that the Chinese have with the example of Russia and the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is very important to them. And they came to one conclusion, which I think was very intelligent, and I think it helps you understand better the Chinese system than the facade, so to speak. They concluded that the Soviet Union collapsed because the rulers at the top did not know what was going on at the bottom. In other words, it was an informational failure. So you needed a system which could capture accurate information, not just spies, although, by God, they got plenty of them in China, that's true. Every department every seminar has a spy in it, but that's another matter. But spies are not reliable. So actually, the Chinese Communist Party functions as an information machine. It has lots of local units, and they are not necessarily simply spying. They are actually listening to people and inventing, and there are even some modest local elections at the municipal level, etc. So I think, let's just say, I'm afraid that the people in the West are demonizing the Chinese a little bit too much. There is change going on China, but it's down there undercover, but it's happening, and I don't see any reason why it isn't going to eventually have, as I say, particularly the sensitivity they have to the need for information, accurate information from what's happening and what people are thinking about and aspiring to at the base. That's very important, and of course it's a structural weakness of any autocracy, specifically, of course, the Soviet system, which produced nothing but disinformation from the base because you had to lie in order to survive, right? Anyway, sorry.
Well, Professor Schmitter can also talk about this, but let me say a couple things. I like the dialectical method. So you should never think that events are moving in one direction, because the very fact that they are moving in one direction creates reactions against that movement. And so there's always a zigzagging in history, I think, in my way of looking at it. You'll tell us if you agree with that. On Europe, I see a kind of zigzagging. I think the fundamental trends and directions are quite negative. I think Europe is complacent. Europe does not have the political mechanisms to take the decisions that are needed because at the national level, democracy is very eroded for different reasons, and at the European level, it hasn't really been built yet. And so we have a situation where we can't really take the decisions that need to be taken. We are competing against a world that has caught up with Europe in the fundamental respects. The advantages that we used to have, high educational level, access to technology and knowledge, these advantages are now well distributed globally. I think, to respond directly to your question, the only place where Eurocentrism still exists is in Europe. I don't see that people in the rest of the world look up to Europe anymore for different reasons. And so the dynamics are quite negative. Now the question I have, and it's entirely possible that Europe will become a fragmented continent where some countries are under direct, immediate American control, other parts are under Russian or Chinese influence. Other parts have become the focus of permanent political instability. Economically, the outlook is not good at all. It wasn't good already. Europe was having trouble competing with, you look at large European companies that have been created in the last 35 years. There's only one. All the large European countries were created long ago, a century ago perhaps. Do you know which company was created in the last 35 years that is a truly global company? It's Zara. It's the only one. So we haven't been able to compete in the new global economy, and I think things will get worse now with higher energy prices, with high inflation that the European Central Bank will have trouble controlling. And many industries, as far as I know, I talked to some of them, are leaving Europe as we speak now because of energy prices, moving to the US or moving to Asia, particularly fertilizers in Germany. High energy-intensive industries in Germany are moving out. Germany is entering a period of a prolonged and deep recession that will affect all of Europe. My outlook is very negative, but then my question is, there has to be a reaction against this. And my question is, what kind of reaction? I think eventually we will have to move towards a political union at the European level. So I don't call it federal, but a political union of some kind, where decisions are increasingly taken in Brussels, not in the national capitals. I think this is inevitable, but it will be difficult. And recently, I'm more and more convinced that the problem with Europe is the excessive power of Germany and France. And we're never going to get the European Union that we need and desperately need until French and German power are diminished.
Are they?
It would be a very good thing. I don't believe at all in the Franco-German engine. I think it's the Franco-German brake. I think France and Germany have become an obstacle to Europe's future. When I say France and Germany, I mean France and Germany as states that insist on being sovereign, insist on thinking of themselves as great powers that they're not anymore. And, my hope is in the new generations in France and Germany that embrace a European future for France and Germany. But so far, this hasn't happened.
I would not be as pessimistic as you. I mean, I understand that many things that you say correspond to the reality. It is clear that Europe has not and will not have anymore the role that it had in the past. But this doesn't mean that Europe will not continue to have a role as long as it can have this process of progressive integration. And it is a fact that the agreement between France and Germany has been the one which moved, I mean, not only of France and Germany, Italy also had a role, also smaller countries like Belgium or others participated to this building up of a union which has known many crises during its history. I mean, Europe had, as I was trying to say in my introduction, there has been several moments in which the role of Europe has been diminished progressively, crisis after crisis. From this crisis, there has been a kind of reaction. I mentioned some of them. I mean, for instance, the oil shocks, and then after, and then what happened when within Europe the Franco-German agreement break during the period of de Gaulle and so on. There was a moment of crisis. Then other countries like Italy and others tried to help in rebuilding this. Then there's been the enlargement to the Iberian countries, which is something which introduced some new dynamics and so on. So it's true that the role of Europe is not the one which existed up to Second World War. I mean, this is quite clear. I mean, this decline started already at the beginning of last century with First World War and so on and so forth. But I think that Europe has still a role to play, not only as a geopolitical subject, an economic subject, because still the most important trade actor in the world is the European Union. So this is a fact. European Union as a whole, which has a common trade policy, but also as a kind of example to the world. It's not that it was before, certainly, but it still has a role and something to say in the world, I think. Last question, it was about the capability to predict some specific events, like the one of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Of course, I think that analysis is very important, and it is useful then for the decision makers to know what they have to do. But of course, it's always difficult to say when things will happen, how, and so on. Very often, this is known just before the event, and this, of course, is difficult then to have the preparedness which is necessary to tackle with this. I don't know if on this point there are any other...
Just very quickly, I think, I did write a couple of articles in January saying that the war would happen. So I feel relatively comfortable on this. I think it is important for academics, journalists to make these kind of predictions, to put our reputations and credibility actually on the line. In that respect, I think we have something to learn from business people that make decisions, make calls, and then get evaluated on the basis of how many things they get right and wrong. So I think it's a good exercise. I suspect it's going to become a very valuable exercise, because this world we're talking about here, full of transitions, contradictions, full of change, is going to be a world where people will be called upon to make predictions about the future. Perhaps in the world of 20 years ago, much more stable, that was not a necessary skill. I think it is a skill now. I don't have a lot of time. I'll just make one quick comment. I noticed back in January, most people could see the dynamics of the war building up and how inevitable they had become. And I won't go into why they had become inevitable. And I think most people that made the mistake of saying there will be no war were simply too attached to the past, intellectually. Because it hadn't happened in the past, then it can't happen in the future. This is a mistake that I see being made all the time. And then, arguments of the kind that, Russia has spent so much capital building Nord Stream 2. Why would they want to waste Nord Stream 2? Well, in a world of trade exchanges and economic exchanges, that would be a stupid thing to do. But in a world of geopolitical competition, Nord Stream 2 is just a geopolitical tool, it's not an economic tool. So again, the mistake seems to be too attached to the way things used to be, and unable to break with the conventions of the past. That is, I think, the mistake, and if we avoid that mistake, we'll do a better job anticipating the future.